The Olivet Discourse has sparked countless debates. Is Jesus predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, his future return, or some combination of both? Or might Jesus be describing the destruction of a yet future temple? Is this tribulation now or something future? And how do we make sense of Jesus' apocalyptic words? Find out today as Dr. Mark Strauss joins us to unpack the Olivet Discourse. Hey all, really quickly before we get into things, first of all, thank you so much for listening to the show. We are so excited to help people dive deeper into their study of Scripture, especially by understanding some of the most controversial and confusing passages in the Bible. And that's where we could use your help. If you've benefited or appreciate this show, we would love if you'd be willing to take the time to rate and subscribe on whatever platform you're using to watch or listen. This will help others join us in studying God's Word. With that, let's get back into the episode. Hi, my name is Kirk Miller, and you are listening to What in the Word, a show dedicated to helping you gain confident understanding of some of Scripture's strangest and most challenging passages. We do this with the help of expert guests, like today's guest, Dr. Mark Strauss. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Kirk.
Mark is the university professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary in Minneapolis, right?
Actually, I'm in San Diego, but
You're in San Diego.
The campus is in Minneapolis, yes. St. Paul,
well,
actually.
The weather is much better where you are most of the time.
Except for the fires.
Yeah, except for the fires. So Dr. Strauss, though, serves at the seminary. He's been doing so since 1993, and he is author and co-author of many books, as well as having edited many, many volumes. And he tends to focus on topics like the Gospels, hermeneutics, and Bible translation. In fact, he is on the committee for Bible translation for the NIV, the New International Version. And so in honor of Mark, I'm going to be using the NIV today on Logos when I have it pulled up. But he also serves on the board of Bible Study Fellowship and is an associate editor for the NIV Study Bible. He's been married for nearly 40 years to his wife, Roxanne, and she is a family therapist, and together they have 3 grown children. And today we are going to be looking at one of the most difficult, what is sometimes called an eschatological text, that is a text dealing with the eschaton, the last things. And this is the Olivet Discourse. Now, the Olivet Discourse, sometimes called the Little Apocalypse, this is a discourse that shows up in all the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We will be focusing, or at least using as our basis, the Gospel of Mark's account of this passage. And this is a passage that occurs in the context of the temple. It centers on the temple. Jesus in Mark chapter 11 has arrived at the temple in his triumphal entry. And then if you remember, immediately afterwards, he cleanses the temple. And so it raises this question of the judgment on the temple system and on Jerusalem, as well as then the religious leaders in the temple court come and they challenge Jesus by what authority he did that act. And so the Olivet Discourse is immediately following on the heels of all this sort of temple heightened kind of interactions that have been occurring. And let me just begin by reading some of the passage. All of chapter 13 is the Olivet Discourse in Mark, but we will just read part of it here, starting in verse 1. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and this is where we get Olivet Discourse, that's where that term comes from, he was sitting opposite the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" And if I can scoot down to maybe one of the more well-known parts of this passage, verse 24 and following, But in those days, following that distress, the tribulation that he was talking about earlier, Here he says, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. All right, and if you are not familiar with this passage, or I mean, even if you are, I would maybe recommend pausing the episode at this point and giving the whole chapter a read. That's probably worth doing so you have some bearings on what we're talking about. But normally I kind of like to mention at this point what makes the passage difficult. There are many things, though, so I kind of want to punt and put that on you, Mark. Can you tell us what makes this passage a difficult text? What makes it confusing to some, or maybe to all of us, and controversial as well?
Sure. And Jesus, it's prompted by Jesus' statement that the temple will be destroyed. And then the disciples ask him, when will this take place and what signs will accompany it? It seems he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But then in the Olivet Discourse itself, he seems to be talking about his second coming. So is he talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in AD 70? Or is he talking about the second coming, which, of course, most of us believe is still future? Or is it some way he's talking about both? And at what point during the discourse is he talking about one, and at what point is he talking about another? And so it creates enormous challenges and confusion. In many cases, almost at the same point, he seems to be referring to both episodes. So did he, and Mark and Matthew and Luke, did he expect the second coming to occur at the same time as the destruction of Jerusalem? Did he get it wrong? There's one of the big challenges right there. So lots of challenges, especially because Jesus seems to be referring to two separate events in the discourse.
Yeah, and there's lots of, we could be spending so much time just on this passage. This passage could be multiple episodes. And so it's very likely we won't be able to touch on everything here. But even that's kind of the broader issue. And then you drill down and there are specific parts of the passage that then sort of impact how you interpret the whole, and all of those can create issues. So there's a lot going on here. Let's begin then just by surveying some of the prominent viewpoints or interpretations of this passage. And all of these kind of can have subsets and variations. So we're speaking very broadly and generally here. But what would be some of the main interpretations? And if you can also then, we'll maybe just begin by identifying one view and then kind of walking us through maybe the main arguments that someone would put forward in favor of that view, as well as how you might respond to it, or arguments against the view.
Sure. And if you think of the two issues, the two events, the second coming and the destruction of Jerusalem, the views can be easily associated with those. One view is that the whole Olivet Discourse concerns the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That would be known as the Preterist view. Preterist means past. And so all of these events took place in the past. The whole discourse is about something that happened in the first century. That's a preterist view. A futurist view, sometimes associated especially with dispensational theology, is that it's all in the future. The whole thing is about the future. It's all eschatological, all referring to the second coming and the build up to the second coming. And then the third view is that it's some combination of the two, that parts of it are about the destruction of Jerusalem and parts of it are about the second coming. And that's when you can splinter into many views as to what parts are about the second coming.
Yeah, which part?
What parts are about the destruction of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So those are the three basic views, either all about the first century, all about the future, or some combination of those two.
All right, let's drill down. Let's start with maybe the futurist view, and oftentimes this is held by dispensationalists, so you might call it the dispensational view, and a whole discussion on dispensationalism would be a conversation on its own. But if you're not familiar with that term, that would sort of be, if you're familiar with like the Left Behind series, not that dispensationalists would endorse that book series as reflecting their theology, but that sort of series of a book series that reflects a 7-year tribulation with a future millennium and a return of Jewish people and God's bringing about promises for them. That would sort of be what is meant by dispensationalism, and they tend to read this text then as referring to that future to come. And if I understand correctly as well, I believe that they would take descriptions here as referring to a destruction then of a third temple yet to be built. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, a destruction, or at least some kind of a threat to it.
Okay, yeah.
Destruction is not actually described, but you do have the abomination of desolation, which of course is a desecration of the temple. So there would need to be. This is one of the reasons dispensationalists believe there will be a rebuilding of the temple, is because you must have a rebuilding if, in fact, you have a desecration of it, and we know it's destroyed and has been since AD 70. So that really is the only reason you need a temple in dispensationalism, because they would also believe that the church is the temple, that Christ is the new temple, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And I think they would go to passages like Ezekiel, like the temple vision there, and see that as referring to a final temple, maybe like in the millennium or something like that. But yes, in this passage, you need a rebuilt temple come to the time of the tribulation, because you need one to be destroyed at this, or attacked, as you said in this case. What would be the arguments that a futurist or a dispensationalist would point out to make their case in this text?
Well, certainly the return of the Son of Man, described in verse 26 and 27, looks to be still future. It's pretty hard to place that in the first century. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels and gather the elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. And if you back up a little bit, then in verse 24 it says, "But in those days following that distress," and you get this whole description that seems to be a threat to the temple, and then immediately in those days, you've got the return, the second coming taking place. So whatever threat to the temple is described seems to be directly associated with the coming of the Son of Man, which they would certainly identify as the second coming.
Mm-hmm. And so this view would allege that a lot of the language here is simply too intense to be describing anything from the past. For instance, in verse 19, when the passage begins by discussing a tribulation. That much everyone is agreed that we begin with with the disciples' question to Jesus about the destruction of the temple. You begin with these statements about sort of these birth pains leading up to what is described here. In verse 14, you have a shift then of this abomination of desolation, and some sort of climactic event is occurring here. The question is, what is all this referring to? That's where we get debated. But a futurist might point to verse 19, because those days of distress are unequaled from the beginning when God created the world, that there's never going to be anything like them again. And how could that describe AD 70, they would say? Clearly, this language is far more intense than what happened in AD 70. This has to be describing something future. If the Lord had not cut it short, no one would survive. There's like universal language of nations coming against others, and so this seems to be describing something much larger. Or even in verse 7, they would point out such things must happen, but the end is still to come. So they would say, this is referring to the very end, Christ's second coming. And so these are pointers that they would use to point that this is describing the future. What problems do you see with this view, though?
Well, let me just add to that. Verses 24 and 25, of course, are strongly apocalyptic language. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky. This kind of cosmic description, they would say, is clearly referring to the end times. That didn't happen in AD 70. Although Josephus might disagree. He might say some of these things did happen in AD 70. The biggest problem is that if this is the case, then Jesus is completely ignoring the disciples' question, because the disciples' question concerns his statement that the temple will be destroyed. And in Mark in particular, that's all they ask. Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? And so he's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem there. Now in Matthew, you've got, and when you bring together the three accounts, in Matthew it says it really describes two events, or apparently two events. It says, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? The end of the age is explicitly identified as one of the questions in Matthew, which shows you that even Matthew is struggling in some sense with whether this, what exactly they're referent here is, whether it's the second coming or the destruction of Jerusalem, because both issues are raised in Matthew.
Yeah, so that these things would be referring to what he just mentioned. It's referring back to the destruction of the temple. And then Matthew is interesting. I did want to point that out, is that he talks about the sign of the coming and of the end of the age. So he specifies then a little bit more than what Mark does. And I want to point out to readers too, given the fact that this is a passage that has parallels in all synoptic accounts, it can be really helpful to use a parallel reader. So like Logos has this parallel gospel reader as one of its tools, and we can just immediately then compare, because it is really interesting to notice the differences, and that can make an impact on your interpretation. But one of the main arguments then against the dispensational or futurist view, and I think this is the one that I personally find decisive against it, is the fact that the whole discourse is it's brought into being as a question about the temple that stands right in front of them. And so for Jesus to either shift to a future temple that is a different temple, or to completely shift to his second coming and not discuss that, it misses the context of what has just gone on. So that's a pretty strong argument in my view. There's also verse 30. I don't know if you want to say anything about verse 30. This is a highly contested verse.
Yeah, it is. And one of the hardest verses in the New Testament. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So Jesus seems to be saying that this generation is going to see these events take place. Now, there's all kinds of exegetical gymnastics you can get around this. You can say this generation refers to the final generation or something like that. But a plain reading of the text seems to suggest that this is going to happen very shortly, or within a few decades, certainly, so that those who are present when they hear this discourse, some of them will be present at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I think there are some who interpret this generation as referring to the Jewish people, but it's just that's very difficult to. It's not very convincing in terms of what this language ordinarily means. And to say that the generation at the time when these things happen won't pass away is a bit of just redundant. It's kind of obvious. Like if they're the generation when it happens, they're not going to pass away. That's kind of just like, it makes no sense. And so that's a very difficult verse to say that if all these things are future, then it seems many Christians would point out that would seem to argue that Jesus predicted this incorrectly, that he saw these things as going to happen in that first generation and they didn't. And it creates an apologetic issue as well about the inerrancy of Scripture. So that is the futurist view. Any other comments you would make about that one?
Well, in response to it, another argument against it is the language they speak about throughout the first half of the discourse anyway, is certainly viable in the first century. The gospel being preached to all nations, I mean, really, that's the book of Acts, right? The book of Acts is the gospel going forth to all nations. So it is going to all nations. The persecution, the statements of persecution that are described there, are also relevant to the first century. You're arrested, brought to trial. Do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at the time. Much of this language echoes what we see happening to Paul and the other missionaries in the book of Acts. And so it is not outlandish that this would be first century language. And even the hyperbole related to the persecution or the destruction of Jerusalem and the suffering that's going to entail. If you read Josephus, it sure sounds like it's the worst suffering ever. Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes he was present on the outside with the Romans during the destruction of Jerusalem. And what he describes is just so horrendous. You can see the kind of language used that could be applied, sort of the extreme language that we see in verses 14 and following.
Yeah. So that language here, there's no other, like, this is the worst suffering ever. And even this language of the sort of this cosmic distress of the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light. This is pretty common, either hyperbolic language or even apocalyptic language from that we find in the Old Testament. In fact, I think a helpful tool as I was doing a bit of study on this passage is if you use one of our guides in Logos, in this case I have the exegetical guide here, there's multiple ways you can use Logos to kind of discern some of these Old Testament passages that are being referenced or alluded to. But the important passages section, and we can change sort of how we want this to play out. But it gives us some of these key passages. Let me put in the entire chapter of Mark. It'll give us some of these key passages, like how Daniel is used to refer to the abomination of desolation. Some of the language here from Isaiah 13 of the sort of cosmic distress, or however we want to state that, or again in Isaiah 34, we clearly see that this is symbolic language used. And although the futurist would say this is meant to be literal, and clearly this has not happened to the starry host, I think many would argue, myself included, that this is language we see in the Old Testament that is meant to be more figurative. But even you also see verse 9, or is it verse 10, the gospel must be preached to all nations. This is a verse that oftentimes gets used at mission conferences, like we must preach the gospel to every nation in order to bring about the return of Christ, which then sort of gets into questions of the imminency of Christ and how can Christ's return be imminent if we still have to preach the gospel. And I actually think, as much as we should want to preach the gospel to all nations, and that's a great inspiration, I agree with you that I think right here Jesus is talking about things that were fulfilled in the first century in the book of Acts. And you remember, someone could say, well, what about literally all nations? The gospel in the book of Acts wasn't preached to all nations, but you have to remember at that time what this would have meant to them. The entire Roman Empire would have, once you've preached to the ends of the earth, that is the Roman Empire. And that's sort of how the book of Acts presents the first Christians bringing the gospel to the entire known world. And so I do think you can say that these things were in fact fulfilled. So maybe we'll move to the second view, which is on the other side of the spectrum, the Preterist view. And this is the view, as you said, that argues that the Olivet Discourse, its content, is fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. And so Christ's coming here, when the passage talks about the Son of Man coming in verse 26, they would take this not to be clear here, they would not take this to be referring to his physical coming, as if Jesus already physically returned. Most people who hold this view of the Olivet Discourse would still believe in a physical return of Christ. So this is called partial preterism. The entire eschatological system is called that. But they would see the Son of Man coming here as more of him coming maybe figuratively. Not that it didn't happen, but it's not a literal physical coming, but he's visiting Jerusalem in judgment is how they would take this. What sort of arguments do you see for and against this view?
Well, certainly, if you look at the background, this is taken from Daniel chapter 7, where the anointed one comes, the Son of Man figure comes to the Ancient of Days to receive authority and glory and power. And so it could well be fulfilled in the ascension to God's right hand, certainly, since the Daniel context would seem to indicate that's what the coming of the Son of Man is. It's a going up to the presence of God. Now, sending the angels and so forth does suggest something is happening on the earth, but that then could be applied to, as you just said, to the coming judgment. Clearly, Israel has rejected the Messiah. The destruction of Jerusalem is in some sense associated with that. So there's no doubt that in that sense, the destruction of Jerusalem is eschatological. It's related to the rejection of the Messiah. It's related to the establishment of the kingdom, which will be consummated sometime in the future. But that it's very much tied to eschatology. So there's no reason we should be surprised to see eschatological language used with reference to it.
Mm-hmm. And here's another important parallel in Luke's account. For example, Luke 21 verse 20. Luke actually says, instead of talking about the the abomination of desolation, he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. So he sort of interprets what is meant by the abomination of desolation, the abomination that leaves desolate, you might say. But he takes this to be very specifically armies surrounding Jerusalem, which I suppose a futurist view could say, yes, in the future. But it seems more natural to take that as referring to what was just about to happen decades
especially since that's what the disciples ask about. Clearly, that's what Jesus is referring to. And he says, not one stone will be left upon another. He's referring to the coming destruction in AD 70. It's hard to deny that. And so I think that when Luke then says the armies are surrounding Jerusalem, you would think of that. You wouldn't think of some hypothetical future.
Yeah. And this view then can make a lot of sense of verse 30. Truly I say to you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. That is quite true under this interpretation. If this is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, then that generation did not pass away. It was within that very generation. And so this view eliminates that difficulty. And so this verse is often appealed to. As you said, they would take the language of the Son of Man coming as meaning very similar to what it meant in Daniel 7, where the Son of Man in that passage, when he comes on the cloud, he's actually going up to, I know like N.T. Wright points this out, for instance, that he is the Son of Man is going up to Yahweh, and it's not coming on the clouds down to earth. And so that's how they would take this language, as it's referring to Christ's ascension and him having authority. Like when he comes and visits Jerusalem in judgment, it will reflect his authority as the one who is the Son of Man, who has been enthroned and sits at God's right hand. That's how they would take this. They would take the cosmic language here as apocalyptic imagery, referring to a time of great distress. And so that's sort of how they would go about interpreting this. What would you see as the main difficulties with this view, in your opinion? Hey folks, we'll be right back to the episode. But first, I want to let you know that this show is brought to you by Logos, makers of the most widely used Bible study and sermon preparation platform. Logos is a digital library fused with technology that enables you to study Scripture both deeper and faster. And we want to help you deepen your study of tough biblical texts, not only by listening to the show, but also by taking advantage of Logos's exclusive perks for listeners of What in the Word. Check out the link in the show notes to access free stuff, discounts, and other special offers curated to deepen your study of Scripture. Interested? Again, follow that link in the show notes. All right, now back to the episode.
Well, I think so often when Jesus speaks about the coming of the Son of Man, there are Jesus and other writers in the New Testament referring to the return of Christ. This kind of language is used, and so I think it's by far the more natural reading of verse 26 and 27 is that this refers to the return of Christ. Cross-reference it to Revelation 19 and 20. Cross-reference it to other statements Jesus says, for example, Matthew 24:25 or 25, the sheep and the goats judgment. I mean, the Son of Man returns and judges the world, and that's the end of the age. I mean, that's the beginning of the new heaven and the new earth. And so it's hard to believe that he's referring to something other than that, when so often throughout the New Testament, the coming of Christ is the consummation of our salvation and the establishment of that eternal salvation.
Yeah, I think, for instance, Revelation, I remember when I was preaching this passage a few years ago, I looked up all the occurrences where this language of the Son of Man and the coming on the clouds and such occurred. And from what I remember, it's very consistently referring to the second coming of Christ throughout. So it doesn't mean that it couldn't be referring to coming in judgment at this point. I'm very sympathetic to this preterist view, for instance. But for example, in Revelation 1:7, behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. And that could be referring again to some sort of visiting, symbolic. I think some people do take it that way. That seems maybe less plausible to me. As well as the mention of the gathering of the angels, sending out the elect to gather the angels. This seems very parallel to apocalyptic language, even in Revelation, of sort of the harvest and gathering at the very end, gathering his people at the end. And so I think it'd be those who take this as referring to AD 70 have to take obviously the gathering of the elect maybe as sort of the assembling of the church, like God going and saving his people through the preaching of the gospel or something like that. But that would be then the preterist view. And then finally, we come to something of like a mixed view, maybe a view that we could say where the two events, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and the second coming of Christ, are telescoped. Walk us through some of the arguments for that view, as well as maybe how you would respond, because I believe this is your interpretation. If we can show your cards a bit, how would you respond to the objections?
Yeah, like you, I would have a lot of sympathy for the preterist view, but some statements just seem so clearly to be referring to the future second coming and the consummation of our salvation. So then you're set with trying to figure out where or when it's referring to each, when it's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem and when it's referring to the second coming. I think it's important to begin with the idea that these two events are very closely related. They both relate to the Christ event, the cross, the resurrection, the ascension. When we say, we want to study eschatology, the end time, some people think we're talking about the future from our perspective. But if you read the New Testament, the end times begin when the Messiah comes and when Christ dies and rises again. You have the beginning of the end time resurrection. The resurrection, which is the last event in human history, has already begun. So you've got this what we call inaugurated eschatology, often referred to as the already and the not yet, where we are saved, but we're awaiting the consummation of that salvation. And so it shouldn't surprise us to find a passage that brings together both events of the first century, which is the inauguration of our salvation, together with the consummation of our salvation. When the final salvation, we receive our new glorified resurrection bodies, and the new heaven and the new earth are established. That's the consummation of what really was established and what was accomplished through Christ's death and resurrection.
And I would say, too, if I can add to that, the temple had such significance in redemptive history that to speak about its destruction would immediately, it naturally makes sense to bring up the second coming, because it would, by their mind, this is... it could signal the end of the world. So I remember, I don't remember where I got this illustration from, if I came up with it on my own, or I think I got it from someone when I was studying this passage years ago. And they brought up the illustration that if you were telling someone, if you were walking through Washington, D.C., from an American context here, and you're walking past monuments and you looked over to someone and said, within a generation, Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol building over there, and you start mentioning things like not a single stone will be unturned, all of this will be leveled. Someone might look at you and be like if you described it in such grand detail, they might look at you and be think this is the end of the world. What you're talking about must be the end of the world from kind of their vantage point. And so it makes sense then that for something as significant as the destruction's temple to occur, that these are associated in their mind. It doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus is saying they will occur immediately one after the other. I think that would be the argument of this view, is that the prophets, it's not abnormal for them to take events. This is sometimes called telescoping, where when you, from a certain vantage point, it's kind of like peaks of a mountain. From a distance, the peaks of a mountain may look like they are immediately next to each other. And so from a kind of a general vantage point, you can speak of them together. But as you get close, you actually see that there's a valley in between, and you see there's a decent amount of distance actually in between them. But from a distance, more impressionistically, you sort of describe them together as related events, even if they are not chronologically immediate events. And so I have found that helpful as an explanation here.
And if you want to be a little controversial, you can say, just like those prophets saw those two events as the same or happening one right after the other, maybe Jesus is still seeing those events as happening one after the other. After all, the Son does not know everything at this point. He's revealing what is being revealed to him. And so you could even say this is Jesus describing it, because this is how it has been revealed from the Father to the Son. at this point. It hasn't. The whole picture has not been fully revealed. That would be controversial for many evangelicals, I'm sure.
It gets into, we're actually going to have an episode on this, but gets into difficulties about that statement, Jesus not knowing the end, and how you wrestle through Jesus's humanity and his divinity. His as a human, there's things that he, according to his human nature, does not know. He says as much, yet he's God and knows everything. So how you wrestle with that. But that could be a possible explanation as well. How would you maybe answer some of the objections to your view here? As maybe one would be the generations not passing away. How would you take that?
Yeah, and I think, let me just map out my view briefly in terms of the actual verses, and then I think I'll suggest why it works better. And it's not without problems. I have to acknowledge that from the beginning, because none of these views are without problems. But I do think Jesus begins by talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He does respond to the disciples' question. And verses 5 through 23, I would say, refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. Everything there described there, from the persecution to the abomination of desolation, to the fleeing Jerusalem, all of these things, if you read through it, to the false messiahs, would fit well within the first century.
Would you say that verses 5 through 13 is sort of the leading up to the destruction of the temple?
Absolutely. And basically Jesus says these are the kinds of things that happen throughout history, things like earthquakes and wars, and so, yeah.
So, because sometimes people take verses 5 through 13, they pull things out of there as if these are signs that we are in the end of end times. Like we are,
and it's just the opposite.
And that's actually, Jesus' point is just the opposite. Yeah. Like I remember when I preached this, I mentioned there was a conflict happening in the Middle East at the time. And I raised the question, is this a sign of the end? And the answer is yes, but maybe not in the way you think it is. Because in this, according to Jesus, 5 through 13, these are things that characterize this entire age as birth pains leading up to the end. But when you have verse 14 to 23, as you're saying, this is where we have a shift to actually describing the very topic of their question, the destruction of Jerusalem.
And that's a good clarification. I mean, I was saying that basically everything up to that point is viewed from our perspective in the past.
Yeah, first century. Yes.
AD 70, yeah. And then we have verses 24 to 27, which seems to me the apocalyptic language could be associated with the destruction of Jerusalem, but I think more likely is referring to the second coming. At that time, verse 26, people see the Son of Man coming in clouds. And as we already discussed, that seems so strongly in a New Testament context to be about the second coming. I would take that as the second coming. Then you have something really interesting that follows that. In verse 28 and following, you have two illustrations of the two events, I would suggest. So you've just described the destruction of Jerusalem, you've just described the second coming, and now you have an illustration of the fig tree in verses 28 to 31, and then you have another illustration of a homeowner, a householder, owner or master leaving and coming back in verse 35 and following. And I think that basically Jesus, first of all, illustrates the destruction of Jerusalem with the fig tree, and then he illustrates the second coming with the departed householder in verse 35 and following. So two events and two illustrations, and that solves a lot of the problems of the language that we see, because that means that verses 28 to 31 are about the destruction of Jerusalem, and so you can say certainly that you will see the signs of it happening. Everyone saw the destruction of Jerusalem coming. They knew it was going to happen because the Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem. It happened within a generation. People are alive. The disciples are alive. Some of the disciples are still alive when it took place. So that fits perfectly with the view that at least earlier in the discourse, he's been describing the destruction of Jerusalem. But then you have this change, it seems. Even though it just said you will know it, in verse 32 it says you will not know it. But about the day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And so, wait a minute, are we going to know it? Are we going to see the signs, or are we going to not know it? He seems to be talking about something else here. And then verse 34, it's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge. each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. So you will not know the time, and we don't know the time of the second coming. That's what's going to be the surprise. And so the first illustration would relate to the destruction of Jerusalem. The second illustration could relate to the second coming. So that sort of gives the whole discourse some structure, and also solves the problem of this generation. And who knows that it's coming and who doesn't know that it's coming.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what's convincing to me along those lines, so just to review, there's a lot going on, so just to make sure we're all tracking, we have Jesus' statement about the temple's destruction and their question in the first 4 verses. Then in verse 5 through verse 13, 5 to 13, we have the signs leading up to the temple's destruction. And interestingly, that section is bookended about language that has to do with deception.
Yep. False Christ.
And so that section, if we could get into the structure even more granularly, you see that the false Christ bookends that, which shows that is a unit of thought. 14 until verse 23 about the destruction of the temple, 24 and following the return of Christ. And now what's interesting then is, like, Jesus gave signs. He says, when you see, in verse 14, when you see. So this is not this is something that they will actually, there are signs leading up to it. There are birth pains, in other words, and then there are clearly signs. When you see these things, he gives them instructions to flee, to go to the mountains, to get out of there, don't be destroyed along with everyone else. And so clearly there are signs. So how do you make sense of the fact that Jesus says you're not going to know this, and yet there's like a fig tree and you can read the signs, you ought to do that? I think it makes sense when you see the fig tree as applying to the signs and the eventual destruction of the temple. And then the unknown time is then referring to his coming that he talked about in 24 to 27. Also, interestingly, I don't know how much I want to make of this, because this is not a very abnormal word, but this language of these things, where Jesus is talking about in 29, even so when you see these things happening, until all these things have happened, this is the exact language he has used up when he's talking about the very question, or the disciples when they say, tell us when these things happen. And so that's referring to the destruction of Israel. And so it could be that Jesus is using that exact same language of these things to indicate that when he's talking about the fig tree here, he is, in this sort of analogy, he is talking about the destruction of the temple. Whereas that language then is not applied to the second coming, which is an additional topic that gets added in. I don't know how much to make of that, but I do think it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I would agree with that. And also, verse 23, you've got, Jesus concludes with, I've told you everything ahead of time. There's a certain measure of closure there. I've told you everything now already.
Yeah, you know
and
it.
And then even though it says, but in those days, in the following phrase, which seems to connect the next one to that, it's still, he says, I've already told you everything. Now we're going to move on to something new. So I can find some justification in a juncture there.
So I think understanding the structure is particularly helpful to this passage. It's one of the most, something that I found the most helpful is once you understand that structure and really what to do with the fact that Jesus gives an analogy where they can discern the signs, but then he also speaks of sort of an unknown time of these events. What do you do with that? And to be clear too, I think we didn't mention this, but I know some preterists would argue that there is a point where Jesus, when he talks about the day or the hour, that there he shifts to his second coming. So I know some preterists would argue that, and that's how they sort of get around that tension between the fig tree and the unknown time. And so there are variations of these views, how you structure it out. But I think the structure is really important to interpreting this passage correctly. We like to close by also providing some reflection on why this passage matters and how we would go about teaching it. So can I ask you, what would you say is the practical significance of this passage? This is all interesting, all these exegetical observations, but why does it matter? What's the significance?
Well, I think the central theme is neither the second coming nor the destruction of Jerusalem. The central theme is watch, be ready. I mean, he says it over and over again. He says, "Blepete," watch, be ready, be prepared, and he says that with both reference to the second coming and the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And so it's the stance that Christians are to have. They are to be ready and prepared, focusing on a life of godliness and holiness before God, fulfilling the commission that Jesus has given them. That preparation is what really the Olivet Discourse is all about. And it applied to those believers in AD 70. It applies to us today as we wait for and look forward to the second coming. So I think it occurs in verses 5, verses 9, verses 23, verses 33, the same word, same Greek word, which basically means look, pay attention, be prepared.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's a really helpful thing to note in this passage. As you look at the structure, one of the things is to note the repetition, using the formatting in the menu here, and then using emphasize. If I emphasize the lemma or the root, I can, as I click on that word, be on guard is how it's interpreted or translated in the NIV. It'll highlight every occurrence, and I can see how it is occurring at important junctures in the text. It's occurring at the end, as we see, but also at these transition points. The other word that is used is, let's see how the NIV translates, be on guard. There's also this language of watch. There's also just the imagery of like, if he comes suddenly, do not let find yourself asleep. That's not necessarily a word that gets repeated as far as I know, but it's the idea of being alert, being awake, we might say, watching out. So even this language of keep watch is repeated. I don't know if it's repeated above, but it's at least repeated at the end. And so, or even as I mentioned, in the verses 5 and following, that bookend of do not be deceived. So this being watchful has both the sense of like, don't be led astray by false Christs and signs that are not indications of the end, but also be alert and live vigilantly as we await Christ's coming, that Christ is coming again. We will give an account in Matthew's, I believe it's in Matthew's version of this, we have the parable of the talents as well. So how we will give an account for how we lived our life. And what suggestions then would you have for teaching or preaching this passage, Mark?
Well, humility is something we should always bring to our exegesis, and I think respect for those who hold a different view. I think we should acknowledge the strengths and even the weaknesses of all the different views, and acknowledge that we simply don't know, and that which plays into the central theme that basically God is in charge, and our role is to be obedient. Our role is to be faithful and to keep watch. And so I think, presenting the various views is important, the background of those views, the context, but then, and even affirming strongly, this is my view. I think this is why it works well. I think this is why it fits Mark's eschatology and Jesus' eschatology, but then focusing on the central theme, which I think is a life of readiness, a life of faithfulness.
Yeah, and I don't think you can punt on what the passage means. Like I know sometimes I've encountered preachers, pastors who, on this passage as one example, it's difficult to know, or maybe they kind of just chalk it up to apocalyptic language, and so just kind of get this broad, general, fuzzy sense of what the passage means. People are going to wonder, like, but what does this paragraph actually, what is it describing? What is it referring to? It doesn't mean that we need to press every detail into saying things that they're not saying. But is it actually describing the temple? Is it describing the second coming? Those are questions I think you do want to answer. I think I wouldn't get bogged down in all the intricacies because there is just too much. But if you give people a broad overview of the views and sort of the main reasons why you find your view persuasive, as well as giving people that structure, I think giving people the structure of this passage will really make the rest of it kind of much easier to understand once you kind of see what every section is doing. So I would, if I was preaching this as I've done, I would kind of start with those things to get that clear the way. with some of that introductory material, and then focus quite a bit on what lessons we can take away from this passage in light of what Jesus is instructing us here. Because this passage does have a lot of imperatives. It has a lot of commands. It's not just, the Bible doesn't just give us information of prophecies and end times just so that we can, speculatively, have our curiosity satisfied, but so that we can actually live differently. And this passage is no exception to that. So, Mark, thank you for joining us. Where are folks able to follow your work? And maybe if you have any current projects you'd like to let us know about.
Yeah, I have a website. marklstrauss.com is my website, and my books and some of my articles and things are there. I don't do a lot on social media at this point. I occasionally post, but not real often. So that would be the best way to take a look at my website and see what articles I posted there.
Sounds good. And I know we have several of your books in the Logos as well. So follow Mark through his books is what he's saying. Buy his books in the Logos. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Before you head out, can I have your attention for one more brief moment? We're so glad you joined us as we dive deeper into God's Word, wrestling with some of the Bible's most difficult and debated passages. We'd love for this material to be available to as many people as possible. And there's an easy way you can help us with that. If you found today's episode valuable, we'd love if you'd be willing to review and subscribe on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch this material. And if you feel especially generous, maybe consider even sharing today's episode on your social media or texting some friends and family. Also, we don't claim to have the corner on the market when it comes to interpreting the Bible. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts and what you think about today's passage. Did you find our interpretation convincing, or what view do you find most persuasive? Let us know in the comments. All right, until next time.